Welcome back to my channel Celebuzz. Please share and subscribe and press the bell icon for new updates. You want them to be there is another thing, but it's true. Picture this. The lights are low. A cigarette burns between two fingers. Across the table, Keith Richards sits back with that smile you can't mistake. The look of a man who's seen everything and doesn't care who he makes mad. In a world where most rock stars play it safe, Keith lights the bomb and throws it. Whether in interviews, books he wrote, or talking backstage, Richards has always been really honest. If he thought your music was trash, he'd say it out loud on TV with no sorry. He wasn't just a guitar player in the Rolling Stones. He was like a guard of rock and roll truth. And over the years, he's made it super clear. There are some singers he just couldn't stand. From famous bands to flashy solo singers, Keith didn't care about your record sales or big concerts. If your music had no feeling or if your big head was bigger than your talent, he had something to say. And he said, it mean. But one of the meanest things he ever said, it was about a singer you'd never think. Someone who once sang for a dead legend. And that moment showed a lot more about Keith Richards than anyone knew. So who made the list? Who did Keith Richards really hate? Let's start with a name that shocked everyone, even fans of John Lennon. Elton John. A funeral stolen. You'd think anyone honoring John Lennon would get a pass, but not with Keith Richards. In his really honest book Life, Richards didn't hold back. Aimed right at Elton John, saying he stole Lennon's funeral and turned it into what he meanly called a big show. It wasn't the feelings of the moment that bugged Keith. It was the big performance. To him, the tribute felt more like a fake show than a real goodbye. He saw it not as being sad but a selling wrapped in lights and ego. To Richards, John Lennon was more than a fellow rock star. He was a rebel, a friend in music and trouble. They shared wild nights, deep talks, and a shared understanding of what it meant to be stuck in the machine of being famous. Keith remembered Lennon, showing up without calling just to escape the Beatles bubble, wanting the realness and freedom of the Stones world. You want to be a Stone tonight? Keith would ask, and John, always up for crazy stuff, would nod, eyes shining with that easy to see Lennon fire. Those moments mattered. They were real. So when Elton stood under the lights with perfect singing and a full show, Keith saw it as something Lennon never would have wanted. He didn't see a friend being sad. He saw a performer taking the spotlight, a showman doing what he does best even in death. And for Keith Richards, being real is everything. Fancy stuff, fake things, showmanship. They're the enemy of truth in music, so if you think that was mean, just wait. Because the next thing Keith trashed wasn't just attribute, it was a crown jewel of rock history, a sacred cow. And Keith Richards, he called it garbage. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, a trash revolution. Millions call it the greatest album in rock history. Keith Richards calls it trash. In a shocking interview with Esquire, Richards tore into Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band one of the most loved albums ever recorded. He called it a mix of trash, making fun of the trippy style and fancy studio tricks that made it legendary. To Keith, it wasn't new ideas, it was showing off. All style, no soul, all idea, no real feeling. He didn't see musical greatness, he saw fake stuff. There's no beat, he said, no guts, no real fire. While others clapped for the album's artistic dream, Keith thought it had no heartbeat that made rock music matter. For him, it was a circus act dressed up in fake smartness, more about ideas than connection, show over real stuff. Even when everyone loved it, while critics fell over themselves to call it perfect, Richards rolled his eyes. He didn't care how many copies it sold, or how many top 100 lists it topped. If the music didn't feel dangerous, if it didn't move your bones or shake your back, it wasn't rock and roll. That's the thing with Keith. He's never been amazed by sparkles or tricks. He listens with his gut, not the charts. He doesn't care about studio magic unless it hits you in the chest. In Sgt. Pepper, it felt too planned, too aware of itself. A colorful package with nothing raw underneath. But if that put-down felt bold, the next one went even further. Because when it came to the kings of hard rock, the band many worship as perfect, Keith Richards didn't just throw shade, he burned the whole house down. Led Zeppelin all sound, no soul. They had the guitar parts, the mystery, the loud crowds yelling their name. But to Keith Richards, Led Zeppelin was missing the one thing that mattered most: soul. In many interviews over the years, Richards has dismissed the famous band with one sharp word: empty. While millions loved their explosive sound and legendary status, Keith just couldn't connect. To him, they were technically good, but had no feelings, a band of great parts that never made a meaningful whole. The chemistry didn't catch fire, at least not in a way that Keith felt in his bones. He did tip his hat to Jimmy Page, calling him one of the best guitar players I've ever known. And he said John Bonham had raw power behind the drums, though he couldn't help adding that Bonham was too heavy-handed for his taste. That loud style. It had no subtlety. It had no swing. It had no feel. There was thunder, sure, but no heartbeat underneath. And then there was Robert Plant. To Keith, Plant wasn't a trailblazer. He was a showman. Like an English Elvis, Richards once said, making fun of the moves, the hip shakes, the microphone spins. It was all show, theater wrapped in echo, flash over fire, performance over presence. That's the line Keith always draws. Real blues versus empty showing off. And Zeppelin. In his eyes, they leaned too far into fantasy, losing the raw emotion that makes rock unforgettable. Music to Keith was supposed to bleed, not shine. But if you think that was bold, just wait. Because the next name on Keith's hit list wasn't a band. It was a one-man empire. A pop star who lit up the 80s with purple smoke and high heels. And Keith Richards, he totally tore him apart. Prince, all show no real stuff. He'd instant heels, played guitar solos like lightning, and ruled the charts with a mix of funk, rock, and raw charm. But to Keith Richards, Prince was all style and no real stuff. At the peak of Prince's fame in the 1980s, Richards didn't just criticize him, he dismissed him totally. In one really mean moment, Keith called Prince an overrated bad word, shrugging off his many different sounds, stage presence, and sexy swagger. To most, Prince was a visionary. To Keith, a glitter-covered distraction wrapped in ego and theater. Richards didn't care how many instruments Prince could play. He didn't care about the outfits, the high notes, or the sold-out arenas. What he wanted, what he needed, was soul, grit, something real. And in his eyes, Prince's act was more about shocking than passion. Carefully, built, marketed, packaged, made for the spotlight, not the spirit. Keith came from the dirty blues bars and dive clubs where cigarette smoke hung low, guitars screamed in pain, and songs were built from blood and heartbreak. He couldn't relate to the velvet, the eyeliner, the perfect poses. Prince's electric performances didn't strike him as honest. They struck him as practiced. Fans were mad. How could someone like Richards dismiss an icon like Prince? But Keith didn't. Back down, that's never been his style. To him, truth always beat popularity, even if that truth meant making millions mad. And if that sounded mean, his next opinion would be even more brutal. Because the next thing Keith Richards slammed wasn't a person. It was an entire type of music. One loved by millions. And to Keith, it was a joke. Black Sabbath when heavy metal became comedy and leather. To some, heavy metal is a lifestyle, a full identity made in distortion, leather, and loud, rebellion. But to Keith Richards, it was something else totally. A joke, he said flatly. In an honest Rolling Stone interview, Keith tore into the entire type of music with a smirk. He admitted he never liked that kind of music and always thought it was great for comedy. The growling singing, the black leather, the devil horns, it all struck him as cartoonish rather than compelling, especially when it came to bands like Black Sabbath, who many credit with creating heavy metal itself. To Keith, Sabbath didn't sound dangerous, they sounded like theater. All bark, no bite. He saw the type of music as rebellion dressed in costume, loud for the sake of being loud, scary without meaning. He didn't hear truth in it. He heard noise pretending to be deep. Even the power chords and pounding drums felt to him like too much. More shock than real stuff. Where others saw thunderous power and wild energy, Keith saw showing off and parody. He believed real rock didn't need costumes. It didn't need a mask and heavy metal. It felt like a Halloween party that never ended. Flashy, loud, and empty at the core. Metal fans were mad, but Keith didn't care. As always, he spoke from the gut, not the PR manual. He wasn't there to say nice things about types of music he didn't respect. And if you think metalhead shat it bad, the next ones might have taken it even more personally. Because the next target on Keith Richards' list, they looked up to him, copied themselves after his band, wore their influences like a badge of honor. But Keith didn't return the favor. Not even close. The Chaos copycats. They praised the Rolling Stones. They copied the swagger, borrowed the attitude, even chased the same gritty stardom. But Keith Richards, he wasn't flattered. He was annoyed. Oasis, the Britpop giants of the 90s, often said the Stones was one of their biggest influences. But to Keith, admiration meant nothing if the music didn't have real stuff. He once dismissed the Gallagher brothers totally, calling them unprofessional, and tearing into their constant fighting, public feuds, and crazy behavior. To him, it wasn't rock and roll rebellion. It was ego-fueled theater with no heart. The drama didn't come from the music. It came from tabloids. And when Liam Gallagher finally met Hissedall, the exchange was pure Keith. Liam remembered approaching Keith at a bar, only to be met with a sideways look and the biting remark, "You're still around, are you?" Then came the kicker. Keith leaned in and said, "One thing I've always wanted to know. Who's the bigger bad word, your singer or mine?" No handshake, no praise, just a verbal slap covered in that signature smirk. It was ruthless. It was honest. It was vintage Richards. But underneath that sharp wit and stone-cold delivery was something deeper. A fierce, almost protective love for rock music. To Keith, it wasn't just noise and fame. It was sacred earned. And anyone who stepped into that space without the solto back it up, they didn't belong. Not in his eyes. That's why his criticisms weren't just insults. They were judgments, warnings, a reminder that in his world, being real rules all. And if you didn't meet the mark, Keith Richards had no problem telling the world. So there you have it, 6 artists. Keith Richards couldn't stand, each for different reasons, but all tied to one core belief that music should come from the gut, not the ego. Some called him bitter, others called him brave. But one thing's for sure, Keith Richards never played by the rules. Not in life, not in music, and definitely not in interviews. Who surprised you most on this list? Do you think Keith was right, or just being a rock and roll troublemaker? Let us know in the comments.